Nina Schick is a political researcher and commentator with Rasmussen Global. She advises business and governmental leaders on political risk, disruptive technology, Russian hybrid warfare, and on Brexit. She worked on the UK's 2016 EU referendum and on Emmanuel Macron's successful bid to become French president in 2017. She speaks 7 languages, including German, Spanish and French, but she was brought up in Nepal. She holds degrees from Cambridge University and University College London. Her fear is allowing others to control her destiny. Nina, thank you for speaking to me.
Thanks, Max.
A commentator, a researcher, how would you describe your position?
Yeah, I think in general, commentating and researching always within the field of politics. And the reason why I was so interested in working in politics is that I always thought I wanted to work on something that was bigger than myself. And it seemed to me that working in politics, where you get the chance to influence or change events that are, extending beyond, your personal nuclear life, that seemed like a worthy cause.
You've worked with some really significant people, haven't you? Rather than becoming a politician yourself. Arguably, you've had more power than a lot of politicians out there.
I would never want to be a politician. It is an awful and thankless task. You're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, as I've seen from my experiences of working with politicians. Yes, so I happened to be in the right place at the right time when I started working politics in the UK. That was just before Brexit happened. So in the run-up to there, I was working at a think tank. We're helping David Cameron with his EU policy. That went really well. Lots of success. And now I'm working with the former NATO Secretary General, and we're looking at issues of Russian interference and how war as a concept is going to develop and change in the years to come as, traditional war is... If traditional war is tanks and little green men, crossing the border, in the next century it's going to be something completely different. So we call that hybrid war.
It's not the sort of job you imagined doing at school. Presumably that was your thought process. So how did you end up there?
The thing is that I think that what's most important is I never kind of had an objective like this is where I want to end up, but I knew what were the most important things for me. So money wasn't the most important motivator for me, and if had been, I'm sure my career would have played out differently. It was the sense that I wanted to work on something meaningful, something interesting, something larger than myself. I was interested in politics, and after that it was always a case of chop and change and be flexible and see what happens. And I think the thing that really worked for me, which is in fact the advice I'd give to anyone else really, is don't always follow the prescribed route. If you feel that you have to follow the route that has been set for you by your parents or your peers, and you don't really want to do that, and you expect the outcome to be different, I don't think that's going to happen. So trust your gut and your instinct and take an opportunity when it comes. And I think that's always been kind of the case for me. I didn't have necessarily an end point. And even now, I'm not at the end point. It's rather than your career or your life being a journey to get to a prescribed position, it's more about what's happening here and now and how can you maximize or how can you use that to your advantage.
Is it about taking opportunities that you wouldn't expect and following them through?
Yeah, I think so. And also, I think I really think it's about trusting your own instinct and not being realizing that the kind of constraints or like the kind of career paths that are set, so the traditional ones, whether it's a lawyer or, you're a banker, those can be quite limiting in many ways. So I actually wanted to be a journalist when I was younger, and the only way that I could see to become a journalist was to kind of go on the BBC training scheme and then do like years and years of training, and then maybe 20 years down the line I could have some airtime. But what ended up happening is that, I got down to like the 20 finalists on this very coveted BBC training scheme. I think 6,000 people had applied and they take 10 people. And I didn't make the cut. And rather than being like completely upset about that and thinking, okay, well, now I could never work in media or be a journalist, I just started working at a think tank and developed my expertise in EU policy. And within like a month of having been rejected at this training scheme, I was doing primetime TV hits, talking about my area of expertise. So there's always another way in.
But you got there much more quickly that way by taking a different route.
Way more quickly by not doing the traditional route.
People listening, though, would say that's easy for her to say, because that's a very bold, brave, courageous thing to do, to go against what's expected of you and to come up with your own ideas as well and go out into this sort of space that you never imagined going into. So what allows you to do that and other people not to be able to do that?
I think it's fine to be bold and to be brave, and especially now, because through things like the internet, through the fact that it isn't the traditional companies or structures that have a kind of monopoly on power. You as an individual, you can make your own content, you can share your own thoughts. If you want to be a journalist, there's nobody stopping you from writing your blog. If you want to be a broadcaster, you can create your own content on YouTube, and you'll have tackled all these questions in your career, Max, because you know that all of this is coming into play with the big traditional kind of broadcasting corporations as well. So I always think, develop your expertise in something that you really care about and that you're really passionate about, and everything else will follow, rather than doing it the other way around, where you're looking more at, I want to have money in the short term, or I want to be at this organization in the short term, because then I think you're selling yourself short. So yeah, be bold, take the risk, and don't always do what everyone else does. There's no guarantee of success if you follow the path that has already been trodden by others, is what I think.
When I said to a friend you should take opportunities you wouldn't expect to take and just keep following them, he said, I did do that, and I ended up somewhere where I didn't want to be, and I'm really miserable.
Yeah.
I think what you're saying is that the opportunities that come up need to have some meaning for you personally. Don't take ones that you're expected to take.
Absolutely. I mean, I've talked a lot to my friends in the UK, and I got an understanding of the kind of immense expectation that is placed on you from a very young age, especially if you come from a kind of middle class or upper middle class kind of background, where you're groomed almost from childhood on to full this kind of professional path and go work in the city. And I was quite shocked to hear that there was this kind of unspoken expectation, and I think that I was free of that because I had a very untraditional kind of upbringing. My father was a complete maverick who basically, he was a criminal defense lawyer, and then he just started traveling the world alone and still managed to make a success of his life, quote unquote. So I didn't have that fear of failure. And also because my mother, she's Nepalese, and she grew up in a village in the 60s in Nepal with nothing. She grew up at a time when she and her fellow her siblings and her friends were not allowed to go to school because they were girls. So there was, if that's as bad as it can get, quote unquote, then I didn't feel like there was no fear of falling. So the only thing for me was that there was an upside, and I didn't have this feeling of expectations that I needed to fulfill in order to whatever that might be in terms of financial terms or like family honor or pride or anything like that. It only seemed that there was a way up. So I think I'll acknowledge that I didn't have that sense of like, this is a prescribed path for you to follow. It was more a sense of, well, what do you want to do? And that's scary, but it's also very exciting because you don't have to do anything you don't want to. People seem to think that work has to be something that's really hard, and in order to get somewhere you have to really put yourself to a drudgery, like 9 to 5, work 15 hours a day. But I think that if your work is aligned with what's really interesting and valuable to you, everything else kind of falls into place.
Well, it becomes part of your lifestyle, doesn't it? I mean, you and I do work 15 hours a day quite regularly, and people say you're working really hard, but it's aligned, as you say.
Absolutely. So then for us, it isn't work. It's genuinely something that we're fascinated by it. And I suspect that it's no coincidence that you and I are working in these areas because we probably have very similar values in terms of what drives us, what constitutes success in our eyes, and what gives us meaning in our lives. And to be able to look at how the world is changing around us, to be able to talk to some of the most interesting people. I mean, that for you and for me, we don't go home feeling, now I want to switch off. Things that happen to you during your work time, the people who you meet, this influences you as a person. It is like who you are as a totality.
But the difference with you is you're living in a different country than the one you grew up in. You were brought up in Nepal, in Kathmandu, which people dream of living there, don't they? And you left there. Obviously, you got a more realistic view of life there, and as you described your mother's experience there as well, where she didn't have very much. But what does that give you that, you know, your British counterparts don't have?
I think that this is why it's so valuable to travel and learn about other cultures, because I mean I grew up in this extremely, everybody thinks their life is normal, you know, or their background is normal, and then actually when you grow up and like meet other people and hear different experiences, and you learn that, you know, you're not normal, nobody's normal, everyone's existence is their own existence. And for me in particular, what struck me is that, you know, I have an extremely strange background. On one hand, I have a German kind of like rebel hippie father who never had to worry about, you know, about things like education or whatever. And on the other hand, you know, my mother grew up with nothing in a village, no access to education, and had absolutely nothing. And they've kind of come together, you know, and made this weird family unit, which somehow works. So I think what that gave me is a great sense of opportunity and possibility, because even if you look at my mother's story to where I am, the kind of it's almost like the American dream, right? It's exactly, and that is something perhaps that my friends in the UK have not seen. So in fact, a lot of people in Europe, you know, for younger people in my generation, they're a generation where we're not expected to do better than our parents. Whereas for me, the step up was immense. Right?
And they feel like, a lot of them feel like they've regressed. They can't afford the house. They can't get a, you know, full-time job in a big brand. They're between contracts. So they're experiencing quite the opposite.
Exactly, which is why I think the necessity to kind of take a risk, to do things differently and not follow these prescribed paths that were set for people of my generation, because their parents were baby boomers, is even more important, because the world of work is going to change. Politics is changing. The way that their parents grew up is not going to be valid for us anymore. So kind of our parents' generation's version of success, I think, is not going to be the version of success for people in my generation.
Your father obviously sounds like a big influence as well, the way he was a bit of a disruptor and anything goes. But was there a moment where there was a turning point for you, where you went through something and you succeeded in it and therefore realised that you could do what you wanted to do?
I mean, I think sometimes I look back at some of the decisions I made, I'm like, wow, that was pretty brave, you know. I think so often I did something more excited by the possibility and not thinking too much of the fear. And I think so whether that's like coming to the UK when I was 18 because I just I want to go live in London, and I had never been here before. You know, did you have
any contacts
here? No, I didn't know anyone, but I was like, it'll be fine. You know, or like when I left, because I did 2 degrees here. I went to UCL and then Cambridge, and when I left Cambridge, everyone was signing up to a graduate program, and because they needed money. And I didn't want to become a management consultant or go and work in the City of London because I knew I wasn't being true to what was really interesting to me. So I just did lots of unpaid internships. Like, was it easy? No. Was it worth it in the long term? Absolutely. And I think that it wasn't, I didn't so much, I had a penny drop moment perhaps when I started getting more conventional success in the terms of recognition and started realizing that, you know, my work was valuable and credible. And then it seemed to have all paid off. And I think what I learned in that moment is that my instincts were correct. And as I develop and I grow, even more I'm finding that to be the case. You know, trust your instinct and it's always good to get advice from people who you trust and who are around to support you, but sometimes asking too many people for their advice for every move muddies the waters, and I think it can be confusing. So the big penny drop for me when I started being recognized in some ways was that my ability to trust my own instinct and not always listen to other people's visions of what they think is right for me turned out to be, a very smart move.
Is your fear perhaps then not being true to, your own path and doing
Yes.
what other people expect of you?
Absolutely. So I think for me, the nightmare scenario is to be caught in a situation where I'm living a life that is inauthentic. So I cannot get behind. So if you were in a profession which you don't really like that much, and you, for example, you're a salesperson, you're expected to go out and drum up business and talk about, the vision of the company, but you don't really believe it, I can't do that. So I think this is why I think everyone should try and align their career or their life to what their own values are. And I think that people don't even know that about themselves because they have so many other pressures on them, whether it's money, family expectations, their peers progressing, that they don't have the moment to sit down and actually think about what is important to them and how they can follow that. So I think fear of authenticity is a big one.
And fear of not living someone else's idea of the life that you should be living. So is that the idea of being controlled as well by society?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think, that's a big one. But that might be because, I might have inherited that one from my dad, who just kind of lived life on his own terms.
He was a bit of a rebel.
Yeah, he was. So, exactly. So everybody, of course, ultimately, my story or my advice might not be right for anybody else,
no.
Right? You have to realize what's right for you, and then I think also do an assessment of what are your drivers? Who are your parents? Are there reasons for why you are the way you are? And the more you understand yourself, I think the more you can understand and begin to realize the path or get on the journey that's right for you. Everyone should go to therapy.
Well, you found your happiness and your sort of, for now at least, a job that you enjoy and a life that you enjoy. And you do that because you're aware that you perhaps a fear of being controlled in any way. But there are lots of people who feel they do want to be controlled. They do want to work for a big brand and climb up the career ladder. Do you think they're mistaken? And they're just fitting in? And they're not going to be happy?
I don't think they're mistaken. I think people are different. So what's right for me might be somebody else's version of an utter nightmare, not necessarily...
The insecurity that comes with your life.
Yeah, exactly. Not being sure about what the vision is, where exactly you would be in the next year or in the next 6 months even, because things can change, as you know, when you work in politics or broadcasting, you could be up all night, or maybe tomorrow there's nothing on. So there's no certainty and there's a lot of flexibility. So whilst that works for me, it might not work for anyone else. So again, for everyone, I think if the thing that's important is to try and understand who you are and what your motivations are, and then build your life around that.
It's interesting because you don't want to be controlled, but you're not. That doesn't sound like you're particularly controlling about what you want to do either. You just want to. You do go with the flow to a lot of it, to a large extent.
I think so, and I think that's something that I think that everybody should do more of, because you can't control everything. Things will happen. It will never be a good time. It'll be never be the right time to start the next job because something might happen, or to quit your job because there might be uncertainty, or God knows whatever decision that you're putting off or avoiding. Life is events, right?
Yeah.
And I think that you have to. In order to move forward, you cannot be controlled by your fear of trying to control all the events and circumstances in your life.
And how would you define success? Because there's what is expected of you, right? There's what you expect of yourself. How do we know when we've succeeded?
To me, I think success can only be one thing, and that is that you are living your life in a way that you are content with. So for some people that might mean big financial gains. For others it's the ability to create something. For others it might be public recognition. For others it might be building a family. So success has to be an embodiment of you living your life in a way that's most valuable and rewarding to you. And, sometimes, recently there's been a lot of kind of death in my family, which leads you to reflect on life. And, ultimately, we're still quite young. Hopefully we have many years left. But life is short, and if you hate doing something, for whatever reason you're doing it, it's just not worth it. And especially because I imagine a lot of people that be listening to your podcast, Max, we have options. We're not living in like the most deprived parts of the world where, because of circumstance or poverty, we can't do many things. We do have options and we have opportunities, and I think that's why if you have those, don't live a life where you're unhappy.
But for the young girl living in Nepal, listening to you thinking, I want to do that, she might be middle class as well, she might not be able to sort of relate to the idea that you would just set off on your own, go to a country where you knew no one, and succeed there. They'd be afraid of that. Why weren't you afraid of that?
Yeah, so I have to acknowledge that, of course, like what I did was also in part due to the resources that were available to me. So like not everyone can do this for sure. And this is why I made the point just now about, those of us who are listening to this who do have some kind of support network. It doesn't have to be financial resources, because I haven't always had financial resources, but the ability to know that, try and war game, like what's the worst thing that could happen if I did this thing that I want to do, but I'm not sure what the risk would be. And once you've like played that out in your mind, all of a sudden it doesn't seem so bad anymore. But undoubtedly, we are lucky. And there are many people, in fact, the majority of the citizens in this world who just don't have those kind of options, because the basics of living, whether that's food or the societal structure in which they're born, limits them such that they don't have choices in their life.
And you're trying to give them hope through your work, presumably, because you're trying to change societies, which is no small ambition.
Well, that's why we work in politics, right? Actually, it's what I've learned from my work in politics is, and sometimes, I still haven't come down on this, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on what you think, given your line of work, Max. But it's this combination of like idealism and hope and utter dark cynicism, where like the more you work in politics, at moments you're like, oh God, was I too naive to come into this with like, bright-eyed, thinking things can change and hope and change, and actually it's nonsense. The world is actually quite a dark place. But on balance, even though I think I'm far more realistic about politics and the cynicism of it sometimes, I still think that there's something worth fighting for. I still think that, and for me, that is the Western kind of liberal democratic state. Yes, we have lots of problems, but it's still the best form of governance. And I think gives a lot of hope to people around the world who don't have the kind of freedoms that we do, and I think it's worth fighting for.
Well, you've got a sense of cause there. I think when I get frustrated with politics is there are too many people more concerned with their career progression and their own personal ambitions, whereas the really successful politicians actually are those who are doing it because there's a sense of cause to it, just as you've described. But it's interesting that you chose not to go down the political route, but just to be advising very senior people and having an influence that way.
Yeah, and I actually think that it's all changing. So because of the big shift in technologies that are available now, the kind of global challenges facing us, and we already see that every day in the political stories that come out, that you're analyzing, or the kind of political challenges that I'm looking at, we are at a crossroads right now. So the traditional vehicles of politics and power is going to change radically in the next generation. This is because of technology, which I think basically means that power, in the way that we've always thought about it and have thought about it since the end of the Cold War or since the end of the Second World War, as being within the confines of a state, because they control all the information, they control the army. That's no longer the case. It's being decentralized through things like blockchain, new technologies like blockchain, which will mean that money can move freely around the world, and so can information. When you look at how propaganda is developing, I think we're entering a really uncertain new phase in global politics and geopolitics. And although there's a lot of doom and gloom around that, that'll also mean that the structures of power can change. So long-winded way of me saying, I agree with you that sometimes I'm very cynical of like kind of the traditional way that politics are set up, because it doesn't seem to have the right incentives in place, especially when you see like egomaniac star politicians who are like not doing their job. Some people come to mind. I would counter that by saying that because the structures of all of this are changing, those who are driven by cause, there's still a place for them in society, and I think everything will look rather different at the end of the next 10 years.
Ending on a word of hope. Perfect. Nina, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Max.